The sky above Rome was a pale, solemn gray, as if the heavens themselves were uncertain of what was about to unfold within the ancient walls of the Vatican. The limousine door opened with a gentle click, and Donald Trump stepped out first, dressed in a black suit tailored with almost military precision. Beside him, a boy with untamed light brown hair and wide, curious eyes followed. It was Elon Musk's 5-year-old son X, gripping a folded piece of paper in one hand and a small, slightly chipped blue rock in the other. The guards at the Vatican entrance stiffened as Trump approached, their ceremonial halberds clutched tightly against their armor. But what caught their attention wasn't the former president. It was the boy who walked beside him barefoot, asking questions in a voice that carried no fear. "Why do they wear metal on their heads? Are they scared of falling thoughts?" he asked as he looked up at the Swiss guards, his head tilted in genuine curiosity. Trump chuckled under his breath but said nothing. "They wear them for tradition, not for fear," one of the guards replied, attempting a smile. Though his expression betrayed confusion, he added, "Inside, the frescoes loomed like silent witnesses. Cardinals whispered in corners, robes rustling like autumn leaves. The atmosphere was dense not just with incense, but with the weight of centuries. Power had passed through these halls cloaked in holiness. It wasn't built for interruptions. And yet that day, it was being interrupted by a barefoot child who carried a crumpled drawing and a question too sharp for many grown men to answer. Pope Leo waited near the entrance to the Sistine Chapel, his hands folded, his back straighter than his 82 years should have allowed. As Trump approached, the Pope nodded slowly, but his eyes quickly drifted to the boy, who now stood between the two men like some accidental mediator in a drama neither fully understood. "Your Holiness," Trump said with a respectful bow, his voice measured, "thank you for receiving us." The Pope looked at Trump, then down at the boy and then back again. "He is young, but his presence feels heavier than yours," he observed quietly. Trump said nothing. X stepped forward, extending the folded paper. "I made this for you," he said with both hands, as if handing over something sacred. "It's a drawing of the world. But the people aren't holding weapons. They're holding hands," he explained calmly. The Pope unfolded the paper. The drawing was crude and colorful, trees drawn like green lollipops, faces made of circles and hearts. But there was one unmistakable detail, a child standing between two tall towers, with a dove flying just above him. The room had gone quiet. Even the cardinals who once mumbled doctrine had paused. "And what is this child between the towers meant to be?" the Pope asked gently. X turned his head as if considering the question again. "He is the reminder. The one they forgot when they built the towers too tall," he replied softly. For a brief moment, the Pope closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in thought. He then looked at Trump, who, though silent, was visibly moved. His fingers tapped against his palm in a rhythm he didn't seem to control. It was a habit Barron had noticed in him once, years ago, when his father was caught between two impossible decisions. "Why have you brought him here, Donald?" the Pope asked. Trump looked down at X and then back at the Pope. "Because I thought we needed to remember what innocence looked like. Before we forget it completely," he said. The Pope's response didn't come immediately. He took a deep breath, turned toward the altar, and spoke as if to himself. "Then perhaps it is not us who should teach the child, but the child who must teach us," he said quietly. As the group moved deeper into the chapel, X suddenly stopped and knelt before a sculpture of the Virgin Mary. He placed the small blue rock on the marble pedestal beneath her feet. "This stone was from a beach where no one was fighting," he said. "So maybe if it stays here, it will help this place feel like that beach." None of the men spoke. Not even Trump. Not even the Pope. The air inside the chapel seemed to pause, as if the walls themselves were listening. The silence inside the chapel wasn't still. It was tense, almost brittle. The kind of silence that trembled beneath its own weight. The cardinals now lined the inner colonnade like statues, their crimson robes pooling like blood on marble floors, their gazes fixed on the boy who had already said too much, or perhaps just enough to unsettle centuries. One of the senior cardinals, Monsignor Tiberio, stepped forward. His voice was sharp, dressed in Latin authority and old fears. "Children are to be seen, not to instruct the Holy See," he stated firmly, almost as a reprimand. X turned toward him slowly. He didn't seem intimidated. But what if the ones who see are blind, and the ones who are silent? Remember better? He asked sincerely. The cardinal frowned, his lips thinning like the blade of an unsheathed dagger. The Pope raised a hand to still him, but it was too late. X had already reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded napkin, the kind given during plane rides. This was wrapped around my apple juice on the flight, he explained, but I wrote something on it when the plane flew through the clouds. I thought it was a message for me. Maybe it was for here too, he added, unfolding the napkin with a tenderness that made even the stoic guards shift uneasily. The Pope accepted it wordlessly. The writing was crooked but clear. A place that fears questions has already lost the answer. It wasn't scripture, it wasn't doctrine, but it was sharp enough to carve into the heart of the old men who stood behind stained glass, convinced they were defending the sacred when they might have only been preserving their comfort. One of the younger priests, barely 30, leaned toward Cardinal Matteo and whispered, "He doesn't speak as a 5-year-old. He speaks like someone who's seen things we haven't. Or like someone who remembers things we've long forgotten," Matteo replied gravely. The Pope studied the boy now, not as a novelty, not even as a guest, but as a sign. Not a prophecy, perhaps, but a reflection. A mirror held up to a church that had long stopped looking at its own face. "You said you brought us a picture," the Pope said gently, "and a stone from peace. But why really did you come here?" X looked up, his voice no longer childlike. It had aged inside the marble. It had echoed in the corners of forgotten prayer. "I came because my dad said the world is a machine, and when a machine breaks, you take it to the people who built it," he answered solemnly. "So I thought, maybe the church built the machine of people, and maybe you forgot how to fix it," he added without accusation, only observation. Trump shifted behind him, visibly caught between admiration and discomfort. It was rare that he was in a room where he wasn't the most commanding presence, and yet this barefoot boy had everyone orbiting around his voice. "I told him this place might be the last place on earth where words still matter," Trump said carefully. "And I hoped maybe some words, spoken by the right voice, might change something," he explained, glancing toward the altar. One of the older cardinal's eyes, watery but proud, stepped forward now, ignoring the disapproving glance of Tiberio. "Child," he said, his voice trembling like a candle in the wind, "what is it you want from us?" X thought for a moment, then turned his palms upward as if trying to feel the weight of his own desires. "I want you to stop building walls with gold and start building bridges with bread," he answered quietly. "And I want this place to be about people again. Not just prayers that float upward, but hands that reach sideways," he added with calm conviction. The Pope leaned back slightly, his breath shallow. These weren't accusations. These were truths from a mouth too small to lie. He looked up at the painted ceiling at the fingertips of God, nearly touching atoms. He had looked at that ceiling 1,000 times, but never had he wondered if perhaps the space between their fingers represented a failure more than a reach. "Bread instead of gold," he murmured, as if tasting the words for the first time. "And hands reaching sideways," he repeated. Then turning to the boy, he asked one final question, the one none of the cardinals had dared to ask. "Do you believe love is more powerful than power?" X didn't hesitate. "Love doesn't need to prove anything." "Power always does," he replied. "No thunder cracked, no stained glass shattered, but something did break something invisible, sacred and old. It echoed not through the walls, but through the hearts of men who had worn their robes for decades, never questioning whether they were protecting the church or protecting themselves from the world." The Pope closed his eyes. It was almost noon now, and the sunlight began to crawl in through the stained glass like slow-moving rivers of color, spilling across the marble floor in silent benediction. The boy, still barefoot, had walked to the center of the Sistine Chapel and stood directly beneath Michelangelo's painted God, that eternal hand frozen mid-reach. X slowly knelt on the cold floor. He did not bow his head. He looked up, and then, in a whisper, he spoke, but not to those around him. "God," he said gently, "if you're still listening, I hope you're not tired of being asked to fix things that we keep breaking." He paused. And if you gave us free will, but we used it to build thrones instead of tables. I'm sorry for that, he added, his voice trembling not with fear, but with something deeper. Remorse he hadn't inherited, but chosen. Donald Trump stood in the far end of the chapel now, arms crossed, jaw clenched. It was the first time in many years that he didn't know what to say. He looked at the boy and saw something that disarmed him more than criticism ever could, an unshakable gentleness. The Pope, still seated beneath the image of the Last Judgment, took a long breath. Then he stood, slowly, painfully, purposefully. His voice echoed, not loud, but unmistakably clear. Let it be written, he declared, that today the Church was reminded of its purpose not by a prophet, nor a priest, but by a child holding a drawing and a stone. The cardinals turned toward him in disbelief. Several took a step back. A few even began to whisper in alarm. I no longer wish to speak only in homilies that please the powerful, the Pope continued. If a child asks us to build bridges with bread, then our gold is now too heavy to carry. And if our prayers don't reach the poor, they do not reach God either, he said solemnly. Monsignor Tiberio stepped forward, his voice sharp again. Your Holiness, surely we must be cautious. This is sentiment, not structure, he warned. But this time it was Trump who spoke. And what has your structure built? Trump asked, stepping closer. Silence? Distance? Fear of imperfection wrapped in ritual? He continued. We didn't come here to be reassured. We came here because somewhere deep down, we still believed you might remember how to listen. He finished firmly. It wasn't a speech. It was something heavier, an indictment cloaked in honesty. The Pope turned to X. Will you leave the stone here? He asked gently. X nodded. Yes, but only if you promise it won't be moved. Not to make the marble cleaner, not to make the pictures more perfect. Just let it stay where I left it, he said, more command than request. The Pope gave a slight nod. It will remain. As it is, he said. Then the boy rose, walking back toward Trump, who now looked at him not as someone protecting a child, but as someone following one. They exited the chapel together. Behind them, a silence took hold again, but this time, it wasn't brittle. It wasn't afraid. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something is rebuilt from within. When the doors to the Sistine Chapel finally closed, the cardinals remained inside, but something about their posture had changed. The robes still held their crimson weight, but their eyes no longer darted toward power. They now traced the outline of a stone resting at the feet of the Virgin. A simple, chipped blue rock that had crossed an ocean in the hand of a boy too young to lie and too brave to stay silent. Outside, Trump and X walked side by side down the Vatican steps. The photographers were still there, of course, lenses aimed like rifles, hungry for controversy. But Trump didn't stop for the cameras. He didn't wave. Instead, he leaned down toward X and asked a question that no one but the boy could hear. Do you think they'll actually change? X didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, blinking into the Roman sun. I think the ones who remember what love sounds like will, he replied softly. And maybe that was enough. That day, the Church hadn't changed its doctrine. It hadn't rewritten a single verse, but a new story had entered its walls, a quiet, barefoot story, with a blue stone, a crumpled napkin, and a voice that made even the most powerful man in the world walk a little slower. And sometimes change doesn't begin with thunder. Sometimes it begins with a whisper that refuses to echo and instead chooses to remain. Let's keep the conversation going. Subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts below. Your perspective is valuable and might inspire others.